Welcome back to Justice Reloaded HD. Let me ask you something from the heart. Have you ever felt so tired, so weighed down, that you didn't need someone to carry your body, but someone to carry your soul? Not with arms, but with empathy. With presence. With love that asks nothing in return. Sometimes, the most healing embrace doesn't come from a parent or a friend, but from a stranger who simply kneels down, looks you in the eye, and says, "I'm here. Only if you want me to be." If you believe that a gentle touch at the right moment can reach deeper than any words, then go ahead and tap that like button, and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. Every week, we bring you true stories from everyday life, quiet, powerful moments where compassion steps in and changes everything. And today's story, it begins in a quiet diner in Colorado, where a waitress carried more than just a little boy. She carried a broken bond, and helped a billionaire father find the courage to hold his own son for the very first time. Let's begin. The late afternoon sunlight poured through the large front windows of the cafe, casting warm honey-colored rays onto the polished wood floors. Laughter from a nearby table drifted lazily through the air, and somewhere in the kitchen, a bell rang softly, signaling another order ready to be served. It was just another slow Saturday at a cozy diner tucked in the suburbs of Boulder, Colorado, the kind of place where regulars greeted each other by name and servers remembered how you took your coffee. George Hammond sat at a corner table with his 6-year-old son Finn. The billionaire's tailored suit looked slightly out of place among the flannel shirts and denim jackets around him, but George didn't notice, or care. His eyes were on Finn, who was quietly poking at a half-eaten grilled cheese sandwich. The boy's legs dangled from the booth, motionless. He could walk, just a little, but only for a few steps at a time. And when he grew tired, as he often did, he simply sat down wherever he was. No fuss. No complaint. Rachel Myers, the new waitress, had noticed that about him. She'd only been working at the diner a few weeks, but she had the kind of eyes that paid attention to small things. How Finn blinked a little faster when he was nervous, how his lips tightened before trying to stand. Maybe it was because she'd spent years caring for her grandmother, who'd been paralyzed from a stroke. She understood movement not as something people took for granted, but as something earned, struggled for. When George signaled for the check, he also gave quiet instructions for the car to meet them out back, by the garden exit. He always chose that exit. It had a small slope, easier for Finn. But this time, Finn surprised him. "I want to go out the back," the boy said, his voice soft. George glanced at the boy's legs, at the few short steps leading to the patio. It wasn't far. A handful of feet, maybe. Finn nodded at the door, determination on his face. George hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." Finn slid from the booth and took one small step. Then another. But when he reached the shallow step that led to the patio, he faltered. His foot slipped just enough for his balance to shift, and he crumpled not hard, but in a way that was more heartbreaking than painful. George stood, instinctively, but froze. He didn't know how to pick up his son. Not really. He'd always handed that duty to someone else. A nurse. A therapist. Someone trained. Someone, not him. Then before he could move, someone else did. Rachel. She was already crouching beside Finn, not towering over him, but kneeling so that her eyes met his. Her voice was soft, almost like a secret being passed gently from one heart to another. "Hey, sweetheart," she said. "You okay?" Finn nodded, embarrassed. His lip quivered, just slightly. Rachel reached out, but not to grab him. Not to scoop him up without permission like people often did with kids who looked fragile. "No," she asked. "Can I carry you out to the garden?" she said gently. "Only if you want me to." For a moment, Finn looked at her, really looked, and then he reached up with his little arms, looping them around her neck with quiet trust. Rachel smiled, slid her arms beneath him, and lifted. George watched, his heart caught between awe and something he couldn't yet name, as his son clung to a stranger with a calmness he had never shown with anyone before. Not even with him. The diner had long since emptied. Chairs were flipped onto tables, the lights dimmed to a golden hush, and the scent of bacon and coffee had been replaced by the soft hum of cleaning supplies. Rachel was wiping down the last booth when she saw him, again. George Hammond stood at the front of the diner, sharply dressed as before, though this time his eyes held something she hadn't seen earlier. Less guarded. Almost uncertain. She looked up, startled, and instinctively tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "We're closed," she said, not unkindly. "I know," he replied. His voice was low, deliberate. He stepped forward, pulling something from the inside pocket of his blazer, a cream-colored business card, embossed with gold lettering. He placed it gently on the counter. "I'm not here for food," he said, then paused. "I came to say, thank you." Rachel blinked, unsure what to say. George's gaze drifted past her for a moment, as though replaying something in his mind. Then slowly he said, "My son Finn, he doesn't let people carry him. Ever. Not unless he absolutely has to. Not even family." He looked at her squarely now. "But today, he let you. Voluntarily. And when he did, he looked at peace." Rachel lowered her eyes, her fingers nervously folding the corner of the damp cloth in her hand. "I don't know what you did," George continued. "But it meant something. To him. To me." She offered a quiet smile, still unsure where this was going. "That's why I'm here," he added. "I'd like to offer you, not a job exactly. More of a presence." Rachel tilted her head. "I'd like you to come to the house," George said, choosing his words with care. "Just on weekends. In the afternoons. You wouldn't be expected to do much. Not care work, not housework. Just be there. With Finn. The way you were today." The request hung in the air, strange and unexpected. Rachel's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You want me to be near him?" George nodded. "That's all. Whatever it is you did, how you spoke to him, how you looked at him, it helped. I don't know why. I just know it did." For a long moment, Rachel didn't answer. She glanced at the business card, still resting on the counter, then up at George. She wasn't used to men in $1,000 suits speaking like that. And she definitely wasn't used to billionaires asking for something so human. Her first instinct was to decline. She had never worked for the rich. Her life had been filled with real things, aches, second jobs, late-night medicine runs for her grandmother. But then she thought of Finn's small arms around her neck. The way he leaned into her without fear, without hesitation. She hadn't seen that kind of trust in a child's eyes for years. So she nodded. "All right," she said simply. "I'll come." George looked both relieved and confused, as if he hadn't expected her to say yes. "I'm not doing this for the money," she added. "I just think maybe your son needs someone who doesn't expect anything from him." George said nothing, but his hand lingered on the counter for a second longer, perhaps in quiet gratitude, before he turned and walked back into the night. The backyard was nothing short of breathtaking. A soft green lawn rolled out like a quiet promise, framed by tall hedges and a winding path of smooth stones that curved gently past rose bushes and into a small grove of birch trees. But for all its perfection, it had never really been used. Not by Finn, not in the way it was meant to be. Until Rachel came. She arrived every Saturday just after lunch, always in jeans and soft cotton shirts, hair tied back in a loose ponytail. She never treated the Hammond estate like a fortress of wealth. To her, it was simply a place where a little boy lived, a boy who needed to be seen for more than his limits. At first, Finn was hesitant, almost shy. But Rachel didn't press. She knelt when she spoke to him, waited for him to come closer instead of reaching first. She carried him not like a fragile thing, but like someone perfectly capable, just in need of a lift. One afternoon, she scooped him up and set him gently on the garden swing. The ropes creaked softly as it rocked back and forth, the breeze tousling Finn's hair. He looked around, wide-eyed, like he was discovering flight. Rachel sat beside him, not swinging, just watching. "You know," she said, "the wind does half the work. All we have to do is let it." Finn nodded solemnly, then leaned his head against the rope. Another time, she brought colored paper and taught him how to fold airplanes. Finn's hands fumbled at first, but Rachel guided without correcting. They ran, or rather Rachel ran with Finn squealing in her arms, chasing the little planes through the grass as they nosedived and spiraled and soared. When Finn stumbled trying to take a step on his own, Rachel didn't rush. Instead, she crouched beside him and breathed in deeply. "Try this," she said softly. "When you feel scared, breathe in real slow, like you're smelling a cake baking. Then let it out, like you're blowing the candles." Finn giggled, then tried it. And when he stood again, it was with less fear and more curiosity. Over the weeks, things began to shift. Finn stopped waiting for her to lift him. He started asking, "Can you carry me to the big tree?" He reached up before she bent down. He wrapped his arms around her neck like it was the most natural thing in the world. And one Saturday, just as she settled him on her hip, he whispered something that made her still for a moment. "You feel lighter when you carry me," he said. Rachel looked at him, heart caught in her throat. "No, sweetheart," she whispered back. "You feel lighter." From inside the house, George watched them through the tall windows. He said nothing. He never interrupted. But he saw everything. The laughter. The trust. The way Finn melted into her arms, not because he couldn't walk, but because, around her, he didn't have to prove anything. George realized then what had been missing all along. His son didn't need to be lifted. He needed to be held. Not by strength, but by gentleness. The kind of gentleness George himself had never known how to give. The golden light of late autumn spilled across the kitchen floor, casting long shadows that danced around the polished marble like memories trying to return. George stood by the window, cradling a cup of black coffee he hadn't touched. Outside, Rachel was in the garden again, her laughter soft, her posture relaxed, Finn in her arms as they examined a bug on a tree trunk like it was a scientific marvel. It should have been comforting. It should have been enough. But something inside George stirred, something raw, unfamiliar, and quietly resentful. It had started a few days earlier, in the simplest, most innocent way. He had been putting away some mail when he overheard them from the hallway. Finn was perched on Rachel's lap, tracing a little crack on the wooden porch rail with his finger when he said, almost absent-mindedly, "If Mom was still here, I think she'd hold me like you do." Rachel didn't speak right away. She simply kissed the top of his head and held him a little closer. But George heard it, every word, and it struck him like a blunt object to the chest. He didn't blame the boy. How could he? Finn barely remembered his mother. She had passed 2 years ago after a long illness, and George, still reeling from grief and guilt, had built walls so high around himself he no longer knew how to step over them. But now, those walls were cracking. He had spent a fortune on private care, the best therapists, every adaptive device the market could offer. But he had never, not once, let anyone cradle Finn without protocols, without instructions, without gloves. And now, here was a waitress from a small-town diner, and his son was comparing her to his late wife. Not just comparing, equating. Something inside George recoiled. Not out of malice, but out of emptiness. Like he'd been replaced in a role he never knew how to play. That night, he didn't sleep. By morning, he had made a quiet decision. He told the house manager to reduce Rachel's weekend hours, 3 hours maximum. No spontaneous visits. All sessions to be supervised from a distance. If she arrived early, she would wait. If she stayed late, she would be asked to leave. No explanation was given. When Rachel arrived the following Saturday, she noticed the change immediately. The gate didn't swing open with its usual welcome. The maid informed her of the new hours with a practiced, neutral tone. George didn't come out to say hello. Still, she smiled at Finn, knelt as always, and opened her arms. The boy rushed into them without hesitation. But something felt different. Not between her and Finn, but in the air. As if joy had been placed under surveillance. George watched from behind his study curtains, arms crossed, jaw tight. Part of him wanted to stop this, whatever this was, before it bloomed into something more complicated. But another part, deeper and more fragile, hated himself for resenting the one person who had brought light back into his son's eyes. And yet, the echo of Finn's voice haunted him. If Mom was still here. George had no response. Because for all his power, all his fortune, all his control, he didn't know how to answer a child who only ever wanted to be held. The garden had been transformed. White silk tents billowed gently in the breeze, and the sound of a string quartet floated over the trimmed hedges like a lullaby meant for the elite. Waiters in black vests glided through the crowd with trays of champagne flutes, and laughter polished, rehearsed, echoed across the stone pathways. It was the kind of party George Hammond hosted when he wanted to remind the world he was still a man of stature, of strength, of power. Finn had been dressed in a little navy suit, his hair neatly combed, his shoes polished though he would hardly walk in them. He sat on a cushioned bench near the edge of the lawn, watching the adults whirl around him in a blur of tuxedos and gowns. Rachel knelt beside him, her hand resting lightly on his back, offering quiet presence instead of distraction. He leaned toward her after a while, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm tired," he said. Rachel nodded. "Want me to carry you somewhere quiet?" Finn didn't answer with words, just reached up with both arms, trusting her like he always did. She stood, lifting him gently, the motion practiced now, second nature. As she weaved through the crowd, she murmured to him softly, pointing out the floating lanterns and the glimmering lights strung through the trees. But the ground beneath her heels shifted slightly, uneven flagstone hidden beneath a spill of petals, and she stumbled. She didn't fall. She held tight to Finn, twisted her body just in time to protect him, and steadied herself before anyone could offer help. But in that moment, someone noticed. Someone with a phone and an opportunist's eye. The camera click was nearly silent, but its consequences weren't. By morning, the headline had already gone viral in certain circles. Billionaire's disabled son carried by Waitress through lavish garden gala. Where was the father? The photo showed Rachel mid-step, cradling Finn in her arms, her face flushed from the stumble, the boy clinging to her shoulder, looking half asleep and entirely safe. To most, it would have looked tender, human, honest. To George, it looked like weakness. By noon, he was pacing his office, phone clenched in one hand, fury radiating from every inch of him. He didn't call Rachel. He didn't ask for her side of the story. He simply summoned his assistant and gave clear, cold instructions. Her presence is no longer required. The message reached Rachel in a plain envelope, delivered by the housekeeper who didn't meet her eyes. She read it once, folded it neatly, and tucked it into her tote bag. She didn't cry. Didn't argue. She only asked to say goodbye to Finn, but the staff had been told to delay her until he was napping. So she took a pen from the counter and scribbled a single sentence on a scrap of paper. She folded it once, then handed it to the maid. "For Mr. Hammond," she said, her voice calm. Later that evening, George returned to his study and found the note placed on his desk. He almost threw it out, but something about the handwriting made him pause. He unfolded it. "Your son never needed me to carry him. He just needed someone willing to kneel and say, 'I'm here if you're tired.'" That was all. No signature. No farewell. No defensiveness. Just a sentence that split through his carefully constructed pride like a beam of truth. He stared at it for a long time. The house was quiet now. Too quiet. And for the first time in a very long while, George wondered whether the image he tried so hard to protect was the very thing that had kept his son from ever truly feeling safe. The house felt colder without her. Not in temperature, but in presence. The warmth that once radiated through its halls, subtle but steady, had vanished the moment Rachel left. The garden went untouched. The swing hung still. And Finn had gone quiet. He no longer asked to be carried. No longer reached out when he grew tired. If anyone approached him, nannies, therapists, even George himself, he shrank away with a shake of his head, burying himself deeper into silence. George tried not to notice at first. He told himself children bounce back. That Finn would adjust. That it was better this way, clean, professional, safe. But then came the evening that broke him. It was just after dusk, when the sky had turned a gentle shade of violet and the cicadas had begun their chorus. George was walking past the back patio, sipping a glass of wine, trying to read emails he couldn't focus on, when something caught his eye. Finn was sitting in the middle of the lawn. Alone. He wasn't crying. He wasn't moving. Just sitting cross-legged in the grass, a worn-out teddy bear clutched tightly to his chest. The boy's back was to the house, his little shoulders hunched, as if trying to fold himself into something smaller. Invisible. George frowned and stepped out, the gravel crunching under his shoes. But when he got closer, he heard something. A whisper. Not directed at anyone. Just spoken into the wind. "If Miss Rachel was still here," Finn murmured, his voice trembling, "she wouldn't have put me down so fast. She would have held me, all the way." George froze. The glass slipped from his hand and shattered against the stones, but he didn't hear it. His knees buckled, and he sank to the edge of the path, heart pounding in his ears. He hadn't cried in years. Not since his wife died. Not during the funeral. Not through the endless court meetings, nor the lonely nights. But this undid him. Because he suddenly saw what he hadn't before, not truly. Rachel hadn't just been a comfort to Finn. She had been a constant. A promise. A soft place to land. And now she was gone. Not because she'd failed, but because he'd been too proud to see her worth. Too afraid of what gentleness might say about him. He looked at his son, this fragile, brave little boy sitting alone with a teddy bear and a hole in his heart, and for the first time, George didn't feel powerful. He felt ashamed. Because Finn hadn't stopped asking to be held out of rebellion. He'd stopped because there was no one left to say yes. Rachel hadn't just carried his son, she had believed in the act itself. She had knelt without hesitation. She had stumbled, yes, but never let him fall. And most importantly, she had stayed until Finn was ready to stand. Now, George sat in the darkness, tears streaking down his face, the weight of his silence finally breaking through. His son didn't need someone who carried with perfection. He needed someone who carried without fear. Someone who understood that holding a child wasn't about strength, it was about presence. About staying. Even when the world whispered that it was time to let go. The sun was just beginning to dip beyond the rooftops when George stepped out of his car, his polished shoes crunching softly on the gravel lot of the small community therapy center. The building wasn't much. Modest bricks, peeling paint, a faded sign above the door that read Hope Grove. It looked nothing like the high-end rehabilitation clinics he'd written checks to over the years. But he wasn't here to sign a check. Children's laughter floated through the air from the garden behind the building. George followed the sound, his pace slow, measured, like a man approaching something holy. The scent of earth and chalk dust filled his nose. A little boy with braces on his legs was drawing stick figures on the sidewalk. Another girl in a wheelchair was tossing a softball to a therapy dog, her giggles rising every time the dog caught it mid-air. And there, at the far end of the playground, crouched beside a sand tray, was Rachel. She wore no makeup. Her ponytail was loose. There were smudges of green paint on her jeans. And she was smiling at a child like the world had never broken her heart. George stood still for a moment, just watching. The tension in his chest was loud, thumping, pressing, unfamiliar. But what he did next was even more foreign. He stepped forward. Slowly, he approached a little boy with curly hair sitting nearby, stacking foam blocks into a lopsided tower. George crouched, his knees protesting slightly, and offered his hands. "May I?" he asked gently. The boy looked up, blinked, then nodded. With hesitant arms, George lifted him, not high, not dramatically, just enough to rest him against his chest. The boy's head settled on his shoulder, warm and trusting. George looked over the child's small shoulder, straight at Rachel. She had turned, frozen halfway through wiping paint from a child's hand. Her eyes met his across the playground. And then George said, with a voice almost too soft for the wind to carry, "I've never held my son without fearing I'd drop him." Rachel didn't speak. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. She just walked toward him, slowly, carefully, until they stood a few feet apart, both with hearts fuller than they could carry alone. George gently handed the child back to a nearby therapist, then turned to Rachel. "I think," he said, "it's time someone taught me how to hold on, without letting go too soon." Rachel didn't smile. Not right away. She just breathed in slowly, like someone who had waited a long time to hear something they thought might never come. And then, finally, she nodded. She wasn't returning as a stand-in. She was returning as something more powerful. A teacher of tenderness. A guide for a father who was ready, at last, to show up with both arms and an open heart. The auditorium was filled to the brim. Parents, therapists, educators, and quiet onlookers all gathered under soft stage lights that painted the room in hues of warmth and wonder. A banner stretched across the back wall, hand-painted by volunteers and children alike, read in gentle cursive, "Arms open, because every child deserves to be held." At the center of the stage sat a small wooden chair. And on it, clutching a microphone slightly too big for his hands, was Finn. His little suit was slightly wrinkled, his shoes just a bit scuffed from pacing backstage, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the look on his face, calm, steady, and braver than a boy his age should have to be. The room quieted as he cleared his throat. George stood behind the curtain, his heart lodged somewhere between pride and awe. Rachel stood nearby, her hands clasped in front of her, breath held like a prayer. Finn looked out over the sea of faces. And then, in a voice soft but clear, he spoke. "When I was little," he began, "I didn't like asking to be carried." A few heads tilted, curious. "Because I thought, if I got tired, people would just leave me behind." Silence. "I thought that needing help made me a problem. That if I asked to be held, maybe they'd put me down too soon, or not come back." A pause. Someone sniffled in the third row. "But now," Finn said, gripping the microphone tighter, "I know something different." He looked to the front row, where George sat, tall still, his eyes shimmering. Rachel stood just behind him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. Finn smiled. "Now I know, if I hold my hand out, there's always someone who will lift me up. Not just with arms, but with their whole heart." A breath passed through the room like a wave. And then, applause. It started softly, then grew until the entire auditorium was on its feet. Some clapped through tears, others with hands pressed to their chest. George stood and stepped forward, meeting Finn at center stage. Without hesitation, he bent down, scooped his son into his arms, and held him tight, this time not out of obligation, but out of understanding. Rachel joined them, her eyes wet, her posture steady. And as the applause continued, she stepped beside George, not as an employee, not as a helper, but as someone who had helped a man rediscover what it meant to hold on. Finn rested his head on his father's shoulder, one small hand still wrapped around the microphone, the other curled into George's collar. Rachel stood close, and in that final moment, amid the roar of healing and hope, she leaned her head gently against George's other shoulder. For the first time, not as someone filling in, but as someone who had found her place. Right where open arms belong. If you believe that the right embrace at the right time can ease even the deepest fears, go ahead and leave us a like. And don't forget to subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD to stay connected with more stories of healing, hope, and the quiet strength of everyday compassion, shared with you every single week. Thank you for staying with us till the end. We'll see you next time.